Because comparatively speaking to the Macho Man Randy Savage, you are nothing but garbage, yeah.
Are you ready?
We're going to take a complete left turn here. We've been churning out lots of watch-related content over the last several months. And now we're going to talk about wrestling, something that was very much a part of our childhood. And when we met in college, very much part of that shared language along with movies that the two of us kind of conversed in. It just kind of became something that was relatable between the two of us, references to it, and then that led to really some deep dives into the wrestling world of our youth.
And I mean, you brought, those of you assiduous viewers of our channel have probably seen references to those same wrestlers over the course of these months. So we look at this as really kind of a chance to fill in some context and get to know us a little better, and for us to just have some fun reminiscing about something that was important to us 35 years ago.
For the thousands in attendance and the millions at home, this is Ticking Gray Bomb, Refined Taste for Idiots, although this one might be Idiotic Taste for Idiots. So the first thing we wanted to chat about was our favorite wrestler. But I wanted to share, I know this isn't a watch-related one, but I wanted to share a watch, and I've been wearing it on a bun strap that made me think of one of the great WWE scrubs of all time, Iron Mike Sharp, Canada's greatest athlete.
It is Iron Mike Sharp.
So our favorite wrestler, the scene is, I would say, probably mid-'80s, maybe 83 to 87. In the Northeast, we got WWF, which then became WWE. We didn't get a whole lot of NWA or AWA. Although WWE purchased some of those promotions over time, and those wrestlers kind of folded into the WWE. When you were growing up, Max, who was your favorite wrestler? Who was the kind of first one that you identified with?
So I think, I mean, everyone, I mean, I would think, when you think of a 10-year-old, who watching, on Saturday morning, waking up and watching, flipping on the TV and watching wrestling, you had to love Hulk Hogan, right? I mean, this guy was a real American.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I think when I started watching he was only kind of in promos, talking with Mean Gene Okerlund about his next fight at the Poughkeepsie Civic Center or something like that. But early on, it was very much kind of the second level wrestlers who were part of what I remember from my morning routine, right? It was kind of guys like Kingkongbundy, as a villain, Big John Studd. I love Junkyard Dog. I love this. Another One Bites the Dust was playing as he came to the ring. He brought a chain to the ring. He had red pants and white boots, and on his rear end it said Thump. And his finishing move was the Power Slam. I mean, I just absolutely love when Junkyard Dog was wrestling.
He was a classic, right? And so that's why I want to, I wanted to kind of context that, where I think Hulk Hogan was probably number one for just about everybody.
Yeah.
But you're right. We really didn't see him wrestle a lot. He was reserved for the WrestleManias, right? The big live performances, where obviously WWF at the time made most of their money. But I have to say, for me, and this guy had, it's funny because a lot of these folks that we mentioned also had a second life moving on. But for me, Hacksaw Jim Duggan, right, was my every time, because it's like, who's my favorite wrestler? Well, every time he comes out, you're like, I love this dude, right? And he was so hokey, right? And he had his, his 2x4 and come out. I mean, because he was like maybe we can't say this today, but he was the quintessential hick.
Glens Falls, New York. I think he was a little cross-eyed.
Yeah, that's right.
Never clean shaven.
No.
Always had a mullet. Always these kind of oversized
Overalls,
blue briefs.
Right. Yeah.
I went to one wrestling event live at the Nassau Coliseum,
The
and
mausoleum.
he is the only wrestler who like slapped hands with me. He had a physique just like a lot of the wrestlers did. They didn't have physiques like they do today, where everyone's got a six pack, everyone's
No, yeah,
cut out of granite. These were kind of former football players. Beer drinking, kind of maybe some weight work, but I wouldn't say they were doing a whole lot of
doing a lot of curls.
sit-ups. Yeah, exactly. And I think, you touched on this, Hulk Hogan, let's face it. I mean, he probably saved wrestling. It's like, wrestling was happening in high school gyms. There were regional
Yeah,
promotions, right? Kind of
territorial.
territories. The South. We mentioned NWA and AWA, right? And when Hulk Hogan got to WWE, he became. I mean, had a shtick. He ripped off his T-shirt. He would kind of rally mid-match, right? Kind of get the energy from the crowd. After the
Right,
match is over, he'd swing his arms out. Can he hear? And he whipped the crowd into a frenzy, and he became a phenomenon. And
right.
I would say that he propelled wrestling to kind of the new next level. And I know today a lot of people look at Hulk Hogan and look at his wrestling in the context of today's wrestlers or the wrestlers of kind of the 90s, and how they were kind of chiseled and how athletic they are. But Hulk Hogan, compared to his peers, was a lot bigger. He was in Rocky 3, right? That put him in kind of the national spotlight.
Real celebrity.
Real celebrity. He was in movies, and he really propelled wrestling and saved wrestling in a lot of ways. And you can say whatever you want about Hulk Hogan, but he was incredibly important for wrestling.
100%. Right. That's why I say, and he was, again, in his later iterations, he became bad. He was coloring his beard, right? But he was truly every kid who was watching wrestling, and probably every adult who was watching wrestling in that era loved Hulk Hogan. Hulk Hogan was everyone's favorite. And then you had someone else, right? Then you had the Junkyard Dog or Hacksaw Jim Duggan or whatever. I was you nailed it, Mace. I mean, he's a great story for American wrestling, and in some ways, he's really a transformational character.
In order to see Hulk Hogan, you had to either pay for the pay-per-view, which my parents certainly weren't going to do.
Correct.
Go to the video store and get the cassette tape of WrestleMania.
Right.
Right. That kind of big build up. I think
2 years prior.
and I think it was Hulk Hogan and Mr. T against Roddy Piper and Bob Orton. I mean, I think that was the main event in WrestleMania, and it was incredible. And then later on, I think when Saturday Night Live was not live, wrestling had kind of a late night promotion on Saturday nights, or maybe it was after Saturday Night Live. But I remember taping it, and getting some of those cage matches with Hulk Hogan and Don Morocco, or stuff like that. But in order to catch him, it was a special event. It wasn't kind of regular TV. So as time went on, did your favorite wrestler change?
So, it's funny that you say this. So, the way I look at it is there were stages, right? I mean, I wouldn't say, when I look at, me as a 10-year-old and me as a 13 or 14-year-old, I would say probably there was some continuity there. Mace, you and I came back to wrestling in the WCW era, right? In the late 90s. Right. And then obviously by then it was almost entirely new cast of characters. I say almost because Hulk Hogan was still there.
Well, that was an interesting time, right? I mean, that became WWE was kind of phasing out the older stars, and a lot of them landed in WCW, right? So you had, Kevin Nash was in WWE, I think as Diesel, Razor Ramon, even Macho Man went to WCW, Hollywood Hulk Hogan. How many of those guys showed up in WCW? They were kind of like Ric Flair showed up from some of those other promotions, but Sting and Lex Luger and a lot of those guys
Right.
ended up
Ric
in
Flair.
WCW. And so for guys who grew up in the 80s, we tended to gravitate towards WCW.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, I was never a Steve Austin guy,
Yeah.
right? So the WWE, this rebranded WWE, didn't really have much allure for me, right? But you're right. There was continuity. There was some continuity with WCW, right?
Yeah.
And so I would say by far my favorite wrestler of the WCW 90s era was Goldberg, was Steve Goldberg. Goldberg had made, and they would just line up and basically bull rush him, spear him, pin him, and game over, right? And there was just so much, I'll just say, I mean, there's just clearly so much kind of testosterone and adrenaline, even for the viewer, that you couldn't top Goldberg for me.
Right. So I'm going to get back to the 80s because I loved when the Ultimate Warrior came out. I mean, I just love this energy. I mean, looking back, this is sort of an embarrassing selection because his microphone work is really pretty terrible. I mean, me and Gene Oakland talking about the gods and the forces of nature and it's utter nonsense energy, right? He sprinted out of the back,
Right.
slid into the ring. Then he had these kind of strings coming off
the tassels,
probably restricted blood flow to his head. And he would kind of shake the ropes. And he just was reckless, abandoned, personified, just jumping off the ropes. And then his signature move was a flying shoulder block. Right? I mean, he was so energetic. I mean, I imagine that wrestling with him was a chore.
And so I want to merge the two kind of the two topics, right? Basically, the Ultimate Warrior with the question around, hey, with time, how do I look on this, right? Because that, in a way, and you're right, Ultimate Warrior was a fan favorite, 100%, right? But as a kid, 11, 12, right, you don't understand this guy, right? But he's bringing a lot of excitement, a lot of energy. But looking back on it, I mean, in a way, he is the poster child for steroid abuse of wrestlers.
Oh, yeah.
Right? I mean, his biceps, right? Of course, yes, he had the little tassels, they tied extra tight, but his biceps were enormous.
Yeah.
Right.
And his physique compared to his peers,
yes,
right, was night and day.
Yes.
Hulk Hogan had giant arms, but he wasn't chiseled.
He was big. Hulk Hogan had a big frame.
It's a big frame. Randy Macho Man was the same way.
Right.
Big frame, not chiseled.
Yeah.
Paul Orndorff, Mr. Wonderful, was pretty chiseled.
Yeah, that's why he was Mr. Wonderful.
But he didn't bring tons of personality to the table. But really, in comparison to a lot of those dudes, Andre the Giant, Kingkongbundy, Big John Studd, they weren't chiseled. And Ultimate Warrior comes out of the gate, and he's like completely different than anyone else.
Yeah, that's a good point. I would like Ultimate Warrior. I mean, I liked Ultimate Warrior. I don't know where he ultimately ranks. I don't think he makes the triumvirate for me of best wrestlers. You mentioned Macho Man. I mean, I love Macho Man, right? Yeah. Everyone loves Macho Man.
I think in retrospect, right, I probably fell in with the way that the WWE wanted me to feel about the wrestlers. The good guys were good, the bad guys are bad. And kind of looking back, you kind of think about like Macho Man and what he did, and he had kind of the female manager who was his wife, lovely Elizabeth, and he brought a bigger frame to some of the aerial, kind of the top rope moves that maybe a more slender Superfly was doing, and his mic work, especially looking back, is very entertaining.
Oh yeah, and that was his shtick, right?
Yeah.
Someone actually just this morning, Mace, someone sent a video. They turned it into a coffee meme But he comes there. He's with Mean Gene with literally
a cup of coffee. Yeah,
a cup of coffee, right? Cup
Yeah.
of coffee in the big time. I mean, and it's clear there's no coffee in the mug, right? It's just a
Yeah.
prop, and he throws it on the floor,
Yeah.
right? You hear it rolling around, doesn't splash or anything,
No.
right? But he's just talking about a cup of coffee. But
And this is Ricky the Dragon Steamboat's cup of coffee in the big time, yeah. Cup of coffee in the big time.
that's, again, it's that energy, and viewed as by a 10 or 11-year-old, right? For a 19-year-old, certainly for a 47-year-old, it's shtick, right? But for an 11-year-old, it's amazing. I mean, it's high art.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, and he got popular in an unconventional way. Remember around this time, these wrestling dolls came out. Macho Man landed on these Slim Jim commercials.
Art thou bored?
Yeah.
Step into a Slim Jim. Turn to the spice.
And he had his own tagline. In fact, one of our friends from college, he adopted that tagline. Tear into some spice, right? You probably do it a lot better than I would, but he became part of kind of the national lexicon, right? Talking about
Right.
turn to the spice and that. And I remember, along with all of those commercials that kind of came out at the time, he got famous kind of, obviously from what he did in the ring, but also through those commercials.
Yeah. Would you say he was a crossover hit, Mace?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Oh yeah. No, you're right.
And he was in one of the I think the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man movies as a wrestler.
Oh yeah.
Early 2000s, before his untimely death.
Right, his demise. But look at it. I mean, he had serious staying power. We're talking about him, and so you're right. I mean, he came a little later, but he had staying power. To your point, for another decade.
Right,
And
I think even though we weren't exposed to him in the 80s, Ric Flair. When I think about like 80s wrestling, I think about Ric Flair and Macho Man, because of really kind of memes or videos that came up after the fact, and probably some of his WC. A lot of him growing up being in kind of the Northeast. I think he was part of those, Southern
Southeast,
promotions.
right.
Um,
Roadshow.
but if I were buying, a T-shirt today, it would probably be, a Macho Man T-shirt or a Ric Flair T-shirt.
Woo!
And in fact, I was looking for this. I must have gotten rid of it. I had a shirt that had Ric Flair's face on one side and the Wu-Tang symbol on the side. So it was Wu-Tang, right? And it was anyway, I think that must have cycled its way out of the house.
Dig it, dig it, dig it, dig it, dig it.